Good evening, everybody. Hi, welcome. Thank you for turning out on this bright and balmy evening. Winter has a cometh. My name is Peter Knox, and I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve University, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this year's Walter A. Strauss Lectures. This series honors a teacher and a scholar whose intellectual passions reflect this university's long tradition in the humanities. Walter Strauss was born in Mannheim, Germany in 1923, and he came to the U.S. in the late 1930s. He joined the faculty of CWRU in 1970 as the first Elisabeth and Walter C. Treuhaft Professor of Humanities in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. A revered and award-winning teacher, after his retirement and until his death in 2008, Professor Strauss continued to offer courses and seminars, both at the university and in his home, that attracted numerous and devoted students and faculty. This lecture series is made possible by the endowment established by Paul Wurzburger, a longtime resident of Cleveland. He and his wife Odette were strong advocates for the arts and generous benefactors of this university. The endowment Paul Wurzburger established makes possible the Walter A. Strauss Lectureship in the Humanities and commemorates Professor Strauss's lasting contribution to the goals Wurzburger cherished. This year's event is the third in the newest phase of the Strauss Lectures, which now take the form of a series of presentations on topics in the humanities of broad interest to the academic community and the public. The lectures will form the core of a book that eventually will be published by Oxford University Press in a series that will honor the legacy of Walter Strauss and highlight the centrality of the humanities at Case Western Reserve University. And what could be a topic more central to the humanities writ large than the creative act of writing, as examined by our distinguished guest, Elisabeth Ladenson, in her series of lectures on the author in the margins. She comes to us from Columbia University, where she is professor of French and comparative literature and has served as chair of her department. Professor Ladenson returned to Columbia, where she received her PhD after teaching at the University of Virginia for 13 years from 1992 to 2005. She has also held visiting appointments at the University of California, Berkeley, and Rice University. Her principal interests are in 19th and 20th century French and comparative literature, gender studies, cultural history, and historiography. Her first book, Proust's Lesbianism, was published by Cornell University Press in 1999 and has been translated into both French and Spanish. She has also edited a special issue of GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies entitled Men and Lesbianism, and published essays on a wide range of subjects in journals including Yale French Studies, the Yale Review, and the London Review of Books. Her book, Dirt for Art's Sake, Books on Trial from Madame Bovary to Lolita, published in 2007, recounts the most celebrated of modern obscenity trials from Madame Bovary to the 1966 trial in the United States over the publication of the 18th century novel Fanny Hill. Her topic then on the eventual acceptance of controversial works of literature is, if anything, even more pressing today. This evening, in the first of her three lectures, Professor Ladenson sets the table for her study of the role of the author in the interpretation of literary texts, starting with the Romantic era with its fetishization of the author as inspired genius, to Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. Professor Ladenson will set the parameters for her discussion of two test cases later this week in her lectures on Wednesday and Friday. Her title today is The Author in the Text, A Brief History. Please join me in welcoming this year's Walter A. Strauss lecturer, Elisabeth Ladenson.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to say that I'm planning on quoting Walter A. Strauss on Friday, so you can all look forward to that. I would like to begin by, so everyone can hear me, yes? Okay. I would like to begin by thanking Peter Knox, Christine Cano, and Maggie Kaminsky for her tireless answering of all of my questions and solving all of my hysterical problems that I've encountered in the preparation for being here. and everyone else who was involved. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for slogging through the unpleasant weather to be here this evening. So this is the first of three, as you know, and this is everything that Peter Knox just said, actually. I don't really need to repeat it. So the author in the margins, a brief history. One of the first things I learned in graduate school was that the author was irrelevant to the understanding of literature. The idea that the author's life or views, or even worse, intentions, were pertinent factors to be taken into account was dismissed as risibly naive. There was even a name for this illusion, the intentional fallacy, part of, or at least relating to, an overarching erroneous approach to literature called the referential fallacy, which sidelined reality itself as a meaningful category in the understanding of works of narrative art. Texts, as we learned to call works of literature, had nothing to do with the world. They referred not to reality, but exclusively to other texts, and could only properly be understood as the product of intertextual reference. Texts emerged, it seemed, out of nowhere and lived their mysterious secret lives in communion only with each other. It was our job as apprentice literary analysts to try to figure out their intertextual networks as though they were yeasts or fungi or bacteria or lab animals of some sort, or else members of some exotic tribe whose social customs we were trying to understand without really knowing their language. Above all, we were to avoid any speculation about the author. The author was dead, we were told, although it seemed more like the author had never really existed in any meaningful way. The author was an illusion, a trompe-l'oeil of aesthetic agency. The author was none of our business. Our business was the text, a term which was satisfying because it sounded like sex, but also made us feel like scientists. And the kind of literary analysis we were learning to perform felt like science, although somehow mystical at the same time. History and biography were beside the point. There was just the reader alone with the text, trying to coax it into giving up its intertextual secrets. It all felt sexy and incomprehensible and a little bit dangerous. None of this made much sense to me. How could the author be irrelevant? How could literature not be about the world? But I nonetheless set about trying to believe it with a certain amount of success, even though it seemed intuitively wrong to imagine that novels, for instance, had no reference to reality. After all, as far as I could tell, offering a particular take on the world was the whole point. I was nonetheless delighted to learn that biography and history were irrelevant to the study of literature, because this meant an implicit invitation to ignore whole areas of inquiry and remain free of all sorts of knowledge. I could comfortably devote myself to remaining ignorant of context of all sorts, and instead learn the names of obscure rhetorical figures, the only tools we were given in our otherwise austere encounters with the text. And as I wrote that, the words anakaluthon, metalepsis, and catachresis leapt to mind. I still have a catalog of these terms lodged in the murky recesses of my memory, even though I'm no longer sure if I ever was what they refer to. That's not true. I actually do know what they refer to, but people generally don't want to hear about this sort of thing, so I keep them to myself. I started graduate school in 1985, at which point the author had been officially dead for some 15 years. It was the waning years of high theory, which meant that it felt as though theory was the only game in town, although it was also presented as an upstart revolutionary force joining valiant battle against the sclerotic powers of critical conservatism. The very category of literary criticism had itself become reactionary. Theory was the name of the game, theory with a capital T. By the time I came along, the irrelevance of biography, history, and cultural context and complete aesthetic and hermeneutic independence of the text were established dogma and had been for some time. This meant that the author's inexistence was at once treated as unquestionable bedrock fact and accepted as an iconoclastic avant-garde credo. As tends to happen with revolutionary movements, or at least academic ones, this felt like permanent upheaval, but was followed by a reaction that was also stylized itself as revolutionary. Looking back, I now realize that my theoretical apprenticeship resembled what is described in the opening paragraph of Swan in Love, the second section of Swan's Way, and I quote just the first couple of sentences. To belong to the little, so this is the opening passage of Swan in Love. Let me start again. To belong to the little set, the little circle, the little clan attached to the Verdurin, it's a description of a salon, attached to the Verdurin, one condition was sufficient but necessary. You had to abide by a tacit credo, one of whose articles was that the young pianist patronized by Madame Verdurin that year, of whom she would say, it ought to be against the law to play Wagner like that, was miles above both Planté and Rubinstein, and that Dr. Cottard was a better diagnostician than Potin. And one of the great things about this passage is that, in fact, you don't have to know what any of the names mean to understand the structure that's going on. Our own credo, so basically the idea is that you have to, in order to belong to this group, you have to believe a certain set of things that you might think are true or not. Our own credo boiled down to the Derridian dictum that il n'y a pas de hors texte, there is nothing outside of the text. The death of the author had been announced by the French critic, theoretician, writer, thinker Roland Barthes in his extremely influential essay entitled La mort de l'auteur, apparently a play on Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, although I didn't realize that until it was pointed out to me many years later. Barthes' essay was first published in 1967 or 1968, which is unclear, but who cares? I mean, I do, I guess, but it doesn't really matter. The following year, Michel Foucault, in 1969, Michel Foucault responded with his own post-mortem entitled What is an Author? Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur? In which he did not memorialize the author so much as relegate him to a function. In any case, the author was sidelined as a living or once living entity. It turns out you don't have to be alive to be pronounced dead, about which more in a moment. So in any case, the author was sidelined as a living or once living entity replaced by a textual author effigy. These two essays, Barthes and Foucault's, spawned a whole school of authorial irrelevance, even as they in no way prevented cool idolatry of their own authors. Barthes and Foucault both lionized as scriptors of these influential texts, which in turn helped usher in an even cooler school of deconstruction with its guru Jacques Derrida, the Mick Jagger of post-structuralism, who was just as author-skeptical as Barthes and Foucault, and if anything, even more generative of his own cult of authorial personality. No one saw this as a problem. Further, including me, further authorial necrologists came along, such as, among many others, J. Hillis Miller, informing us that Shakespeare is an effect of the text, which was pretty obvious to begin with, but in any case, the author's biographical irrelevance was not new. It was not really news. Wayne C. Booth had, for instance, come up with a less Gallic version of Foucault's author function in his influential 1961 Rhetoric of Fiction, in which he coined the term implied author to refer to much the same phenomenon, carefully distinguished from both narrator and actual author. A decade later, the focus had shifted, as per Wolfgang Iser's 1974 study entitled The Implied Reader. So the focus shifted from the author to the reader in the 70s, basically. But in fact, all this, too, turns out to have been less startlingly original than one might think, since the mid-20th century had been replete with dethronings of the author on both sides of the Atlantic, although not on both sides of the Channel. France was slow to join this movement, but quick to put its imprimatur on the death of the author in the late 60s. I would hazard a guess that the French had failed to notice the various new critical movements that sprang up in the US and UK and sidelined the figure of the author as a distraction from the text itself, simply because the French don't tend to read much criticism that isn't translated into French. And no one, I do think that's the reason, and no one bothered to translate I.A. Richards or F.R. Leavis or John Crowe Ransom into French. But the demise of the author was announced repeatedly over the course of the 20th century in Anglophone academic circles, one of the many forms of aesthetic revolution that characterized that period in a variety of realms, both before and after World War II. Dada, Cubism, and Surrealism, abstract expressionism, and pop art in the plastic arts, architectural and urban planning movements that transformed urban centers and also decentered them, atonal music, and of course various movements in literature itself. It is hardly surprising that literary criticism would have produced its own scorched earth innovations, critical equivalents of the architect Le Corbusier's 1925 proposal to raise much of central Paris on the right bank of the Seine and erect rows of giant cruciform 60-story towers in its stead. The literary critical version was formalism in all its various incarnations, including post-structuralism, with their signature insistence on the text as an aesthetically autonomous phenomenon to be considered in the absence of what had previously been its crucial context, biographical, historical, and cultural. The history of literary criticism and theory of approaches to reading literature is like the history of architecture or the history of 19th century France, in that it consists of a series of alternating revolutions and reactions. It is markedly unlike architectural history or that of 19th century France, obviously, in that it has few lasting visible entailments. Theoretical scorched earth leaves no scorch marks to speak of. If Le Corbusier had had his way in 1925, Paris would look very different now. Literature, however, has continued to exist, and authors to write and critics to pronounce on what they write, and sometimes to be listened to, if only in the form of podcasts, despite the best efforts of Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, both of whom are now actively dead in a way that is perhaps not quite true of Balzac or Proust. Or Le Corbusier, for that matter. And although I feel a bit as though I'm sawing off the limb I'm sitting on a la Wile E. Coyote, I can't resist quoting Jean-Francois Revel, the political philosopher or journalist who wrote a book about Proust in 1961, same year as the rhetoric of criticism, called simply Sur Proust, on Proust, and which is rarely alluded to by Proust scholars for reasons that will probably become clear in a moment. This passage, which is my translation, is from the 1976 preface Revel appended to On Proust for a new edition. I quote, "Does literary criticism exist? Is it possible? No system of literary criticism has ever been retained by posterity." When I first read this, this is me, that's Revel, and I'm going to go on with him, but when I first read this, I thought, oh, come on, that's not true. And then I realized that it kind of was. So this passage is quite amazing, I think. So does literary criticism exist? Is it possible? No system of literary criticism has ever been retained by posterity. What's more, every system of literary criticism appears necessarily as the fall guy, tête de Turc is the phrase in French, of the next generation, and without hope of rehabilitation. The John Crowe Ransoms of today, he actually says the Émile Faguets of today, but I'm using John Crowe Ransom. The John Crowe Ransoms of today mock the John Crowe Ransoms of yesterday, comfortably installed in the tumbril that's taking them, like their predecessors, to the guillotine. Seeing the previous critical systems fall does not worry the authors of the next critical system any more than the demise of a political regime disturbs the author of the coup d'etat that founds the new regime. And that concludes this passage of Revel. Unlike successive architectural trends or political regimes or even sartorial fashions, movements in literary criticism don't leave much of a trace, nor do they have much effect on actual reading habits among the general public while they're dominant, which is why the dead author approach was never put any sort of dent into sales of literary biography or cinematic biopics, as I'll be discussing cinematic biopics on Wednesday. In fact, the evanescence of literary critical trends made it difficult for me to find an equivalent of Émile Faguet, the turn of the 20th century French critic Revel is still able to allude to recognizably in 1976. I chose John Crowe Ransom not because I thought that everyone would know who he was, but because I'd already mentioned his sonorous mid-20th century American name. The influence of literary critical trans is discernible only negatively in the direction the pendulum swings when it's reached its apogee and the force of gravity takes over once more. We are thus now in an advanced stage of the anti-death of the author parabola, at a moment when identity politics has combined with Me Too, the Me Too movement, to cause syllabus upheavals and purges of the works of authors accused, suspected, or convicted of inappropriate behavior. We can talk about this during the discussion if you wish. For the moment, I'd like to go back to what the 20th century, so you can tell me I'm wrong about Me Too, but in the discussion if you like. Not that I've really said anything about it, but anyway, we can go. For the moment, I'd like to go back to the 20th century critical movements, to what the 20th century critical movements were repudiating, namely the late 19th century academic approach, which was literary history, and before that, the great man paradigm, in French known as the l'homme et l'œuvre method, the man and the work method, most famously associated with Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. What Barthes and Foucault were repudiating in the late 1960s was the distant descendant of the literary history criticism set in place by the great French academic successors of Sainte-Beuve, himself essentially, I'll talk more about him in a second. Sainte-Beuve was essentially himself a journalistic critic, since modern, that is to say post-medieval literature, was not a topic in the French Academy until the late 19th century. Notably his successors, notably Gustave Ladenson and Fernand Brunetière, the literary historians of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Barthes took aim at his contemporary, the 17th century scholar at the Sorbonne named Raymond Picard, with whom he'd had a protracted battle in the mid-60s, fought with books and articles about Racine and about criticism in general. Picard, although 2 years younger than his attacker, willingly took on the mantle of the ancien in this quarrel of ancients and moderns. He responded with a book entitled Nouvelle Critique, Nouvelle Imposture, so New Criticism, New Hoax, published in 1965. Again, no one concerned seemed aware of the Anglo-American strains of new criticism, which had been steadily simmering away elsewhere and which bore a certain resemblance to Barthes and Company's method, but which was to appear horribly irrelevant by the time this pithy Gallic version was translated and exported. Thus, the French announced the author's demise, but in fact, as Barthes himself acknowledged in his essay, something like it had already been noted several times in the early 20th century alone. He's referring exclusively to France, by Mallarmé, by the poets Mallarmé and Valéry, and most loudly and influentially by Proust. Before getting to Proust's part in the murder or perhaps euthanasia of the author, it's important to understand why and when and how the latter was so excessively alive that he had to be eliminated in the first place. No argument of this sort, as far as I know, predates the 19th century. Indeed, arguments about whether Homer existed, and if so, whether he was a blind bard who had written or sung both epics, or rather created both epics attributed to him, or whether the author of the Odyssey was in fact not Homer, but an authoress, as Samuel Butler insisted in a book published in 1897, as well as the still raging Shakespeare authorship question. All this originated in the 19th century. Until then, Shakespeare's plays had been written by Shakespeare. And as for Homer, it was, I believe, Aldous Huxley who had the last word on his identity when he said that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written either by Homer or by someone else of the same name. It was the 19th century that started fretting about authorship, and that was because of what happened in the late 18th century with Romanticism and the romantic cult of the author. Rousseau, for instance, received tons of ardent fan mail, I think literally tons of ardent fan mail from women inflamed by La Nouvelle Héloïse, which was first published in 1761. The early 19th century, as you all know, was when poets like Byron and Shelley became rock star-like cult figures, and like rock stars like Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin, they lived and wrote hard and died young. These English Romantic poets enjoyed the same kinds of cult in France. French Romantic poets took a different approach, running for office like Lamartine, or becoming national monuments like Victor Hugo, among whose later works is a book on the art of being a grandfather, perhaps the least sexy topic imaginable. And so it might be said that the modern author was born or invented in the 19th century and killed over and over again in the course of the 20th. But to take up my architectural analogy once again, while Le Corbusier was not in the end, and we can all be thankful for this, invited to raise the right bank of Paris to make way for 60-story cruciform towers in 1925, his mid-19th century predecessor, visionary of modern urban destruction and geometric renewal, Baron Haussmann, had been successful in tearing down and enduringly transforming the center of the city. The author, too, came under attack during the very century that saw his invention. I would suggest that Gustave Flaubert was the first to take down what Foucault would call the author function. Before Flaubert, writers, novelists like Balzac and Stendhal, the proto-realists, pioneers of what would be called French realism, had used a technique in their fiction which they had, consciously or not, borrowed, either directly or via French authors like Diderot, from Henry Fielding, in which an omniscient or semi or selectively omniscient narrator, speaking as the author, his narrative stand-in or proxy, addresses the reader directly over the heads of his characters. For instance, in the famous, here's the two French examples of the influence of this. For instance, in the famous opening description of the Pension Vauquer in Le Père Goriot, the 1835 work in which he inaugurated the recurring character theme idea that launched the Comédie Humaine, Balzac, or his narrative proxy, addresses his reader, who is explicitly assumed to be a bourgeois man comfortably ensconced in his cushy armchair, to tell him that while he, the reader, will certainly never experience the seamier side of Parisian life, the author narrator is here to tell him all about it so that he, the reader, doesn't ever have to get his soft white hands dirty. He explicitly talks about his soft white hands. Or in the opening description of the small provincial town of Verrières in Stendhal's 1831 Le Rouge et le Noir, The Red and the Black, the author, as always assumed to be a Parisian bourgeois, is told by the author narrator what he would see and think if he were to go to Verrières, which he's certainly not expected ever to do. The author is there to save the reader the trouble of even getting out of his armchair, of ever getting out of his armchair. As Balzac especially gives the distinct impression that he'd be delighted to bring us our slippers and light our pipe if he could. It took me a while to understand these passages fully, to the extent that I can claim to understand them fully or ever could, because I was taught never to conflate what we call the authorial persona or narrative stand-in for the biographical author. And I still think it's good practice to note that the version of Balzac or Stendhal or Fielding or Dickens or Thackeray, for instance, who talks to you in the margins of their novel, is not exactly the same textual entity as the one who writes letters, not to mention the actual human being doing things other than writing, which Balzac, for one, seldom ever did, it seems. As a result, though, of being repeatedly warned of how important it was never to mistake the Balzacian narrative persona with Balzac himself, it took me years to fully realize that the reader, the implied reader, and also the actual reader was expected to do just that, to understand this as the author talking to us. In these narratorial remarks to the reader, we're invited to feel chatted with by Balzac or Stendhal or Thackeray or Fielding, by the author. And while it's hard to top Balzac's tender attentions to making sure we're comfortable so that we may better appreciate his tales of how those without comfy armchairs live, the author's generally jocular address to the reader is an innovation from the English tradition, which started with Fielding in the 1740s and continued to be popular in British novels throughout much of the 19th century, a favorite technique, the textual equivalent of breaking the fourth wall. It crops up all over the place in the British novel of the 19th century, notably, for instance, in Dickens, Trollope, Thackeray, and George Eliot, who begins a chapter of Middlemarch in direct address to the reader and explicitly cites Fielding as its model. And this also, what also happens as a result of this is things like "Reader, I married him." You have from Tristram Shandy in 1760 to throughout the 19th century, you have narrators who are you have fictional narrators acting like they were the author and directly addressing the reader with, so again, Reader, I Married Him is probably the most famous example of that in Jane Eyre. In France, however, this technique, which was never put to as broad and sustained use as in Britain, and I think that that's probably true because the English novel of the 19th century is often fundamentally comical in a way that the French novel is not. But that's not the only thing going on. Okay, so in France, however, this technique, which was never put to as broad and sustained use as in Britain, disappears after Balzac. And its disappearance may, as I've suggested, be attributed to Gustave Flaubert, who made authorial interventions uncool. In his attempts to demarcate his I mean, he's not comical, he's very ironic, but he put an end to this. In his attempts to demarcate his territory following the death of Balzac in 1850 and take his place as preeminent French novelist, Flaubert, who was 29 in 1850 and raring to go, he'd written a number of first-person autobiographical or semi-autobiographical fictions in his youth, but he then decided to jettison the Balzacian authorial persona entirely, and I think that he was trying to dethrone Balzac and establish a new model for the French novel, which, in fact, he succeeded in doing. He declared that fiction should be entirely impersonal, and that, as he put it in a letter to Louise Collet, as he was trying to write Madame Bovary in the early 1850s, the author should be, in his novel, like God in the universe, present everywhere, yet visible nowhere. Partout présent, mais visible nulle part. Hence the ubiquity of free and direct discourse, free and direct style in his writing, in which the omniscient narrator is eclipsed or rather reconfigured to become a vehicle for various characters' points of view. For instance, a famous instance when we're told in Madame Bovary that Charles Bovary's conversation is as flat as the sidewalk and as uninterestingly populated. It is evident that this observation represents the opinion of his frustrated wife, but it's simply relayed as part of the narrative itself, and the reader has to figure out whose point of view this is. We're never told whose point of view we're getting. We have to figure it out for ourselves. So that was the end of Balzac bringing us our pipe and slippers. Flaubert was by no means the creator of this free and direct discourse technique, which can be found free and direct style, which can be found all over the place in 18th and 19th century fiction, but because of his eschewing of other forms of narration and almost exclusive use of it, free and direct style has long been associated with Flaubert. What's remarkable about the refusal of the authorial persona and sustained use of free and direct style is that it immediately creates the opposite, as I said, of the Balzacian pipe and slippers care of the reader, what Barthes calls the texte de plaisir, text of pleasure approach. The implied reader all but disappears, and the actual reader is abandoned by the implied author to his own devices, left to figure out not so much what's going on, but what to make of it. In fact, Flaubert's ditching of the narratorial persona played a large part in the 1857 trial of Madame Bovary on grounds of outrage au bonnes mœurs, obscenity, basically. With the author's textual stand-in went the novel's moral center of gravity, and I wrote about that in Dirt for Art's Sake. I wasn't certainly not the first to notice that. It had been written about before, but it's really quite remarkable. It's a matter of style, and the style creates a moral problem, what was viewed as a moral problem. And once Flaubert had jettisoned the author in the text, subsequent writers followed suit. By the end of his career, in the 1870s, he died in 1880, I believe, 1880 or 1881, he had become a venerable elder, claimed as their literary mentor by Zola and his disciples. Flaubertian impersonality became the watchword of the highly influential school of naturalism, internationally influential school of naturalism, founded by Zola, with the result that in the works of Émile Zola and company, in the absence of a central authorial narrator, one tends to get description always ostensibly filtered through, or at least attributed to, a given character's perspective, sometimes with unwittingly comical entailments. At the same time as the author was being purged from French fiction, his centrality was being questioned in other ways as well. The earliest explicit formulation of what became The Death of the Author that I know of, and if anyone can correct me, I'll be grateful to hear about it, comes from the same pen which had previously announced a few years earlier The Death of God. In his 1887 Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3, Section 4, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote the following, I quote, "In a case like Wagner's, which is in many ways an embarrassing one, although the example is typical." He was not happy with Wagner, obviously. In a case like Wagner's, which is in many ways an embarrassing one, although the example is typical, my opinion is that it's certainly best to separate an artist far enough from his work so that one does not take him with the same seriousness as one does his work. In the final analysis, this is a great passage. In the final analysis, he is only the precondition for his work, its maternal womb, the soil, or in some cases, the dung and manure out of which it grows, and thus, in most cases, something that we must forget about if we want to enjoy the work itself. Our understanding of the origin of a work involves physiologists and vivisectionists of the spirit, never the aesthetic men, the artists, never. And then he adds the following, "In fact, the case is this. If that's what he was, he simply would not present, imagine, or express it. Homer would never have written a poem about Achilles, or Goethe a poem about Faust, if Homer had been Achilles, or Goethe had been Faust. A complete and entire artist is forever separating from the real what actually is." I find this passage, end of quotation. I find this passage from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals intriguing on a number of levels. Obviously, the soil or dung from which it springs is the philosopher's contending with his objections to Wagner. The following year, he wrote Nietzsche contra Wagner, of which this passage is clearly a forenote. Specific animus aside, his general point in the first part of what I just read is approximately the same idea that would be repeatedly propounded throughout the 20th century, from Mallarmé and Valéry through I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis in England and the new critics in America to Barthes and Foucault and my teachers in graduate school. The author is an irrelevant distraction. It's the text that counts. And as I've probably emphasized more than enough already, but will repeat at least one more time, the death of the author notion that made structuralism and post-structuralism seem like such revolutionary movements, or like such a revolutionary movement, structuralism and post-structuralism being sharply distinct from one another only until one attempts to compare them to anything else, that this death of the author notion was not in fact a new idea at all, going back at least to Wagner and reappearing in various forms in different critical tendencies over the course of a century. But it somehow managed to seem like a new idea for two reasons, I think. One was, again, simply that the French hadn't noticed that the author had already been sidelined because they weren't paying attention to critical innovations in other countries and in other languages. They were reading Nietzsche, but because he was a philosopher, not a literary critic, and because his dismissal of the author as mere soil or dung or manure or a womb was presented not as literary criticism, but rather as one among a number of opening shots in his war against Wagner, it was not taken as the theoretical statement it in fact is. And indeed, to my surprise, when I looked at all the treatments of the history of this idea, as well as polemical chapters in it that I could find, not one of them cited this passage. I mean, I suppose it's certainly possible that I missed something, but nothing I could find cited this passage, although several of them referred to Nietzsche in a general way and even alluded specifically to the Genealogy of Morals, but not ever to that passage. The other reason the death of the author is always associated with Barthes and not any of his many predecessors I believe, is simply that he coined such a memorable formula for it. Foucault is also credited with a major salvo in this debate, but what is an author is not a pithily repeatable epigrammatic phrase. Rather, it's a willfully obtuse, disingenuous question posed for philosophical purposes of defamiliarization. Foucault is, in this regard, riding Barthes' coattails, and I'm not convinced that the allusion or intertextual reference to Mallory's Mort d'Arthur is what gave the formula its staying power. Again, it was decades before I noticed this aspect of the phrase, which may be embarrassing for me, but it does, I think, furnish a small empirical proof of its negligibility. Instead, what makes the death of the author so powerful a slogan is its elegantly laconic demonstration of its own paradoxical point. The phrase is, after all, referentially meaningless. The author, in the absence of any context, is by definition an abstract entity, and as such, is impervious to literal death. As an obituary, therefore, it makes no real sense, unlike an announcement of the death of the author of something. It's like the death of irony, except that the author is in principle a person, whereas we know that irony is an abstraction. But then real sense is obviously not the point. The announcement in question is of the death of an idea, or rather the calling into question of an idea. Barthes' title means, in effect, what you thought about authors isn't true, or forget about the author is irrelevant. From now on, there's only the text. It is, in effect, a performative statement, like, I take this woman to be my lawful wife, or I christen this ship the Queen Elizabeth, J.L. Austin's classic examples of performative utterances, except that it contains no verb and is therefore disguised as a non-performative utterance, a noun clause announcing an essay on something that in principle must already have happened, but which is, in fact, being brought into being, or rather non-being, by the title itself. The title of Barthes' essay might therefore be reformulated as, or expanded into, the performative utterance it secretly harbors, as something like, with this essay I declare the author to be irrelevant. Because if the author were really dead, he would have had to be alive. And Barthes' point is that someone we call the author who is or was alive, Barthes' point is that there is someone we call the author who is or was alive, but he doesn't matter, and isn't what we thought he was, and we should just ignore him and concentrate exclusively on the text with no reference to the author, its author, which is, in fact, precisely what Nietzsche had already pointed out in 1887. It is the second pronouncement of the aforecited passage from the Genealogy of Morals that interests me in particular. And here we come to Proust's critical role in the history of the death of the author. Proust, who read Nietzsche, but as far as I know never refers to that passage, was and remained a big fan of Wagner, but like Nietzsche's, his anti-author stance is propelled by a theoretical animus that feels personal, although the two cases are very different in a number of ways, among others, in that unlike Nietzsche, Proust never met his avowed enemy. Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve was born in 1804 and died in 1869, 2 years before Proust's birth. He was the preeminent critic of the mid-19th century in France, author of a youthful autobiographical novel audaciously entitled Volupté, and more importantly for many years, a weekly newspaper column more importantly for posterity, if not for him, the author of a weekly newspaper column in Le Constitutionnel called Les Causeries du Lundi, so Monday Chats, which were regularly recycled into volumes of criticism. In addition, he wrote a number of books about the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries and a prominent study of Port-Royal. He was fond of making pronouncements along the lines of, I read great literature to no great man, and expressed critical opinions about contemporary works based largely and openly on his direct knowledge of their authors' personal characteristics. In short, for Sainte-Beuve, even dead authors were very much alive, and indeed the author was the main reason to read books in the first place. If this sounds ridiculous in our post-Barthes, theoretically authorial post-mortem world, let's not forget that there was a rich tradition propounded among many others by Descartes, and especially popular in the 17th century, which held that books were valuable in so much as they allowed one to commune with great men and even possibly women in their absence. Books are the closest we can get to communion with great figures who are gone and whom we might not have known anyway. This was related to the idea also popular in the salon-rich and highly epistolary 17th century, according to which conversation was an art form and correspondence was prized as the next best thing, une conversation entre personnes absentes, a conversation between people who aren't there. It's also true that I mean, if Sainte-Beuve sounds ridiculous, we should just think about how many biopics are made. And again, I'm going to talk about them on some of them on Wednesday. But the biographies of authors are probably more read than their works themselves. At least in the case of Proust, I strongly suspect. Weirdly enough, Proust begged to differ. Beg to differ in terms of Sainte-Beuve. He started arguing with this notion of literature as a way to be friends with departed great men and women in his 1905 essay Sur la lecture, on reading, which he then recycled as the preface to his translation of Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies, half of which is a celebration of reading. In this essay, Proust began worrying at two equally improbable bugbears, reading and friendship. Is reading a form of friendship, as Descartes and Ruskin suggest? Well, maybe to some extent, responds Proust, but friendship itself is annoying and to be avoided. He writes this in his novel as well, involving as it does conversation and thus social time wasting, but at least one can put a book back on the shelf. That's what he says. That's literally what he says. What he really objected to was the cult of the author as embodied by Sainte-Beuve with his erroneous estimations of contemporary works based on his personal assessments of the personalities of their authors. The critic isn't mentioned in the body of that essay, but Proust ended up festooning it with long anti-Sainte-Beuve footnotes, which form a sort of subterranean argument raging at the bottom of every page. And after a few years later, it climbed out from the footnotes in that essay, and he started inveighing in a more open manner. A few years after publishing On Reading, Proust can be seen hesitating between writing something like a conventional novel, or something that was intended as something like a vaguely conventional novel, and framing his ideas as an attack on Sainte-Beuve cast in semi-autobiographical framework, a conversation with his mother. He says his mother, but I suppose he means his authorial persona's mother, about the critic's faulty assumptions and resulting errors of judgment. In the end, he wrote a number of essayistic pieces arguing against Sainte-Beuve, which didn't see print until they were put together and published in the mid-50s, so 30 years after Proust's death, by Bernard de Fallois under the title Contre Sainte-Beuve, which is a title that's very similar to Nietzsche, Contra Wagner. It is one of the signal ironies of this story that Sainte-Beuve's name lives on largely thanks to Proust's attempts to assassinate him posthumously. But everything about Proust's part in the history of the author function is imbued with various kinds of historical irony, and I propose to devote the conclusion of this talk to an attempt to identify and elucidate them. And then on Friday, after taking a look at similar issues with Colette in the interim, I will return to Proust to examine the specifics and entailments of the strange relation between the author and his narrator in that case. The most obvious problem with Proust's central role in the history of anti-author arguments in France, again, a role Barthes fully cedes to him in The Death of the Author, is that À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, his magnum opus, in which he outlines most forcefully in both expository form and as demonstrated via various characters, the idea that the author as a human being is irrelevant to the work is largely autobiographical, the novel that is, and has most often been read as though it were straight autobiography. In other words, as though the narrator were simply Proust. And in fact, Revel says that. Revel just assumes that it's autobiography, and he's by no means the only one. It is not, and he is not. The author is not the narrator is not the author, in many ways and for many reasons, and again, I'll be talking about this on Friday. Proust would therefore be seen to be engaged in some sort of disingenuous reader-baiting game when he argues for a strict distinction between the author and his work in the course of a semi-autobiographical novel in which the narrator is never named, but at one point, many hundreds of pages in, cagily proposes that if his name were construed to be that of the author, it might well be Marcel. But that's after hundreds of pages. From the very, maybe thousands of pages actually. From the very start, we had maybe like 2,000 pages. From the very start, we have a nameless first-person narrator telling us about his childhood. There's nothing to indicate that it's not simply a memoir. This is surely why the title, In Search of Lost Time, he was infuriated when critics said, well, it's a memoir, presumably, but there was no indication that it wasn't. This is surely why the title, In Search of Lost Time, with its active Indiana Jones overtures, has been so vocally preferred over Moncrief's Shakespearean Remembrance of Things Past, which suggests someone nodding by the fire, old and gray and full of sleep, whereas in fact insomnia is the operative mode. In other words, Proust would seem to be the most unlikely of anti-author activists. He refers to his narrator in his correspondence as je, as I, as though it were simply him, and in published commentary referred to the narrator as being both him and not. He repeatedly says he's this guy who is and isn't me. Why then does he take this stance insisting on absolute theoretical distinction between the author and his work? Let's take a look at his arguments and fictional demonstrations briefly, I promise. His argument is a bit different from Nietzsche's, although it comes around to approximately the same thing in the end. The biographical author of a work, the actual human being who goes about his daily business in the world, he writes, not that Proust himself went about much daily business, but let's leave that aside for the moment, is not quite the same entity as the deep self, the moi profond, from which the work of art truly originates. The author, or from which, it's really a thing in the author. The author as social being is thus irrelevant, and Sainte-Beuve was wrong to conflate the two, the banal social entity in the world with the moi profond, the deep self of the artist. Thus far, he seems to be in agreement with Nietzsche, but when the latter goes on to observe that if Homer had been Achilles, he wouldn't have written the Iliad, Proust's case would seem to diverge completely. In Search of Lost Time is more like what Homer might have written, if he'd had writing at his disposal, that is, if he'd decided to write an epic about a poet trying and mostly failing to write an epic. Nietzsche's take on the mystery of Homer's identity is succinct in the extreme. Not Achilles is who Nietzsche tells us Homer is. For him, what the author does is create. The author creates an inward-looking activity, and the characters he depicts act, which is why literary biopics are generally so unsuccessful. There is only so much desk-bound, if febrile penning that can go on the screen before it becomes boring. Pages are crumpled up and thrown into the wastebasket. Quills are sharpened, but it's basically not that spectacular a spectacle. Proust would seem to agree, except that by the time he comes along, a mere few decades after Nietzsche published his Genealogy of Morals, which came out when Proust was 16, it came out in German when Proust was 16, the Homer-Achilles opposition was no longer so clear, and indeed his own novel helped to destroy it. In Search of Lost Time, along with such other works of what came to be called modernism as Ulysses, To the Lighthouse, and Mrs. Dalloway, and works by Kafka, Faulkner, etc., tear down the Homer-Achilles opposition by focusing resolutely on the everyday, the non-heroic, the epic of banality, a process begun by Flaubert and greatly accelerated by Proust. The difference between Homer and Achilles in Nietzsche's scheme of things, is that both are interesting because of the latter's actions, and thus Achilles is interesting in himself as a character, whereas Homer is uninteresting to the point of non-existence for himself, and therefore largely irrelevant in himself as author. Achilles, it's the product, it's Achilles that's interesting. Using these criteria, things are similar in the case of Proust, and indeed he concluded these, included 3 author figures in his novel to demonstrate just this principle. I don't have time to go into this in detail, so I'll just cut to the chase. Proust has 3 author figures, Vinteuil, Bergotte, and Elstir, respectively, a composer, a writer, and a painter, and they're all demonstrations of the principle which is also directly explored in expository commentary in the novel, namely that the work and the apparent person of the author have little to do with each other, since the work is produced not by the author as social being, but rather by his deep self, which is inaccessible to social observation and expressed only in the form of art. Thus, Vinteuil, a great composer whom we first encounter as a composer through Swann's adulation of his music in Swann in Love, turns out to be the same Vinteuil previously introduced in Combray in the previous section as the mild-mannered and slightly ridiculous small-town piano teacher who is something of a joke because of his devotion to his daughter, whose lesbian relationship somehow causes his death. Which is, death. So in Proust, there are lots of characters who just, so sexuality can actually kill members of your family. Your sexuality, just by existing, can kill members of your family, is an idea that Proust's work retells in various ways. So Swann keeps thinking, I wonder if the great composer Vinteuil has anything to do with that ridiculous music teacher in Combray, but he never remembers to ask, and therefore Vinteuil dies before he ever realizes that, in fact, it's the same guy, and he knew the great composer. He just didn't realize he was a great composer because the author and the work have really little to do with each other. Similarly, Bergotte, a prominent writer, adulated by the young protagonist until he gets a chance to meet him, at which point he finds it almost impossible to reconcile his image of the great author with the mediocre personage with whom he's expected to make banal conversation at a dinner party. As for the painter Elstir, he resembles a canonical bohemian artist in most particulars. He's an impressionist, pretty much, until we discover that we had earlier met him as the young pet artist of the pretentious Vinteuil Salon, Verdurin Salon mentioned earlier. The point which Proust makes over and over again in various different forms is essentially Nietzsche's point, that it doesn't matter who Homer is a social being, it's his depiction of Achilles, and that alone which should interest us. Fair enough, but as I noted earlier, the sort of epic Proust is writing is entirely free of Achilles-type exploits. Proust's Trojan War is an inward battle, his siege of Troy an epic depiction of writer's block. Thus, in these terms, Homer and Achilles resemble each other to the point of being consistently conflated. Homer is often called Proust, while Achilles is referred to as Marcel. There's really, the difference is infinitesimal. And yet, I would say that Nietzsche's observation still applies to Proust, just in a different way. The difference between the author and his work, in Proust's case, is not the difference between creating and acting, writing and doing. The important difference, which has not been given sufficient scrutiny, in my opinion, for reasons that have everything to do with the history of readings of the author, which I've tried to trace, however briefly here, is between the social identity of the author and that of his narrator, and that's what I plan to discuss on Friday. Unlike what's different about Proust and his narrator is not that one creates and the other one doesn't, because in the end they both do. One does earlier than the other one, but that Proust is a Jew and a homosexual and his narrator is not. And so that's what I'll be talking about. And Jew homosexual snob also is what I'll be talking about on Friday. In the interim, on Wednesday, I propose to look at the question of the author and her work through the example of Colette, her writings, and how her work has been depicted, especially on screen in the many biopics she's inspired over the years, and thus to bring gender into this a bit, and then sexuality and social identity on Friday. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that autopsy. We have time here for some questions and comments, and I'll bring the microphone to you so that you can be heard on the recording of the event. I trust you all to project, but we are recording.
Thank you very much for that. That was great. I wanted to ask you, you'd invited questions about earlier articulations of the irrelevance of the author, and I want to just point out two of those and suggest maybe a different motive, or a slightly different motive. And the Kierkegaard, I think the 1830s or 1840s, and then Diderot, both, the way Kierkegaard puts it is that...
Where is this?
It's Kierkegaard's. It's this. E. Ping Ong in a recent book writes about this. It's an early essay of Kierkegaard's. I can give you the.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah. And what Kierkegaard says is he's writing a review of a novel by Hans Christian Andersen, a realist novel, and he says this is a terrible novel because the author, you feel the author there, right? Uh-huh. And so the problem is an aesthetic problem. The problem is that absorption is impossible insofar as we feel the presence of the author essentially shaping events and precluding our capacity to imagine that we're seeing the unfolding of events. For Diderot, it's in his writing on painting, right? So it's not authorship, but there's an analogy with Proust, and in that he says any intention to create a spectacle is alienating, right? And so why, Chardin, for example, right, would be the, and in some ways there's an interesting, Chardin and Flavel, right? There's a kind of, this isn't that interesting, this is just ordinary life, right? Mm-hmm. But that's because it's aesthetically draws you in, it's absorptive. And so the question I have then is, for those writers, and I wonder maybe for Proust, is the issue less a theoretical a question of a kind of absolute philosophical division between reader, or between author and work, or narrator and social persona of the author, and rather is an aesthetic question. In other words, it's not the case that all works the author is irrelevant. It's rather the case that for good works or great works, the author disappears.
Thank you. That's interesting. Well, I think that, the idea that a novel is bad because you can feel the author, I think that's, I think that's a technical problem, right? I mean, it means that the author hasn't achieved. I didn't even know that Hans Christian Andersen wrote realist novels. By the way, maybe there's a reason for that, actually. I think, for instance, Stendhal. I've always thought that Stendhal was born 100... he also seemed to think that maybe he was born 100 years too early. He should have been a filmmaker. I think he's actually kind of a bad writer. For this very reason, because like Dostoevsky, Stendhal has way too many sentences that begin with suddenly. Right? When you see too many sentences that begin with suddenly, you get, at least I get, an image of the author sitting there going... Suddenly there was a knock on the door. He opened the door. Who's there, he said. And the author's going, oh God, who's there? What? I think that's a different problem. It means that the author hasn't entirely mastered the techniques of the genre. I thank you. That's really interesting. I think that... I think it's a little bit of a different question. It's not, you're right, it's not theoretical. It's an aesthetic question. We shouldn't be thinking about the author. But when Thackeray actually, in a passage that I'm sure that I read, but could not find when I went back to find it to put it in this talk, I'm sorry to say, I swear there is a passage in Vanity Fair where it's not there. It's not there where I thought it was anyway. It must be somewhere. I'm sure I didn't make it up. Where a character is going to propose marriage to another character, and something intervenes, and the authorial persona says, thus he was prevented from proposing to her because blah, blah, blah happened, because blah, blah had to come up and tell him something. But in fact, of course, dear reader, the real reason is that if he had proposed to her, this book I have so many more pages to write in this book, would just have to end now, and I can't do that, right? That is someone who's really in control. Right. It's the opposite of what you're talking about, I think. If you see the author when he doesn't want to be seen, then it's like watching someone like pull the curtain back at a play, thinking that they're not being seen. You're seeing something you're not meant to see. It means that there's a lack of mastery there. In terms of Diderot on painting, that's really interesting. Do you know which? I would love to take a look at that if you have the reference. That would be great. Thank you. That was interesting.
Yes, thank you also for this interesting talk. And my comment, I'll try to keep it short, my comment is to get back to the way you presented graduate school, and I'm pretty much a peer of this time as well. And the idea there, though, that I felt was emphasized where I was the intentional fallacy more than the death of the author, meaning the kind of way we had been taught maybe in high school, that an author had put this secret meaning into the text, and it was our job to go there and get it, and knowing her or his biography wasn't going to help us get there. And I want to tie this to the second thing that I would like to comment on, which is the importance of epistolary novels, because exactly epistolary narratives showcase the lack of control that a letter writer, as an author, then has. You write it, the letter goes. You can't control the meaning you wanted to put in there. And I didn't really hear much. Maybe I have to come back on Wednesday, but if you could comment on those two aspects, thanks.
Yes, the first one, yes, absolutely. As for the second one, one thing that when I was thinking about this, one thing that really struck me was that Fielding is the man. And in fact, Fielding starts out parodying Richardson's epistolary novels, right? So I think, this is something that I'm very intrigued by, and I don't have an answer to it. I haven't spent enough time thinking about it. It just really came up when I was writing this. Like, how is it? It's so interesting that that this enduring form of narrative, this sort of ludic narrative approach that had such legs in the English novel over the course of at least a century and a half. How is it that it came out of the parodying of parodically responding to these huge, very serious moral epistolary novels? And so there's something about, I think, Richardson's epistolary because of course the epistolary novels always, Richardson's and everyone else's, maybe, I think, always have a preface by the author posing as editor, saying, well, I found these in my grandmother's attic, and I'm just presenting them, but here's what I think about them. And I think maybe it was the parody of that got Fielding, that it was parodying that caused Fielding to come up with this. I don't know. I think it's really it's a really, really interesting question. Thank you.
So I see two more questions here, and then I want to make sure that you all noticed that there was some lovely food and refreshment in the foyer.
I begged him not to say that earlier.
where we can enjoy each other's company and engage Professor Ladenson in questions there. First here.
I was fascinated by your talk. I'm not a scholar. I look at these issues from the viewpoint of a reader. And it interests me that for over 100 years, the focus on the author was the public's focus. They thought, ooh, if I read this, then I will get to know this famous person so much better. Mm-hmm. It was supported, for example, by Dickens coming to the U.S. and giving talks and reading parts of his novels to huge audiences. Scholars are not interested in that.
Sure they are. Yeah, they are. They may be interested in a slightly different way, but yeah. Well, I mean, also, authors give readings in bookstores and stuff, and people flock to them. I mean, the thing is that what happens in academia stays in academia, is my point, I guess, because people never stopped reading biographies. People never stopped going to hear authors. I mean, bookstores closed, right? I mean, that's happening less because people are buying things online, and so there are fewer bookstores. But they're generally packed. Unless they're academic authors, in which case they're not that packed. But I mean, authors giving readings and signing books, those events are packed. They're still, yes, there's something that has never gone away. That's never gone away, and I think that. And thank you for pointing that out. I think that that academic theoretical dismissals of this are kind of doomed because it's empirical evidence suggests that the author is not that actual readers do not find actual authors to be actually irrelevant. So thank you.
So I'd like to thank you for speaking, but my question is, do you think that we would be less interested in the question of killing or not killing the author in modern literary criticism if our canon were more diverse? Like, if we read more female authors, would we care as much about Hemingway as a sexist? Or if we read more black authors, would we care as much about Lovecraft being racist?
So many things. One thing that I was planning on saying in this, but ended up running out of time, was that, as was pointed out by various people in the 80s and 90s, and probably in the 70s as well, but particularly in the 80s, feminist critics, it was very convenient that the death of the author coincided with the recognition of authors, of women authors, and authors from traditionally underrepresented minorities. So I don't think that Barthes and Foucault or any of those people who were sidelining the author were deliberately doing that for that reason, but it is an undeniable historical confluence. I think that what's happening now is, I've read with interest a lot of articles about people sort of taking, I can't remember where a course on the films of Woody Allen was, I think was actually not canceled, but there were calls for it to be canceled. People have taken Junot Diaz novels off their syllabus, David Foster Wallace, various. I think that there are a variety, as I tried to suggest, I think in the one sentence that I devoted to this issue, I think that it's a matter. I think that probably this means that the pendulum has reached an apogee and is starting on its way back because the author. But the author, there's an extreme focus on the author, but only it's a negative one. right? Who doesn't get represented? Why are we reading dead white guys? Why are we reading someone who's accused of doing something like that? Why are we reading him? That kind of thing. I think these arguments are problematic. But certainly it's true that the history of sidelining the author has coincided with an attention to authorial identity in terms of underrepresented categories. So there's something going on there, certainly. I don't think that the way it's been treated recently is the best way to treat it, but there's certainly something going on there. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, I want to thank you for all of these questions and comments and for coming out on this evening. You know, in my my own field of ancient Greek and Roman literature, we deal with somewhat or same problem from a somewhat different perspective, because our authors are not only merely dead, they're quite sincerely dead. And so often in our field, scholars have been motivated to do everything they can to put flesh and bones on them, which proves always to be futile. But maybe that's something we can talk about out in the foyer or over dinner. In the meantime, please join me in thanking Professor Ladenson.